Space Camp. I review them sporadically at all hours of the day and night. You know, there's been so there are a few things, you know, I'll go through sort of the various pieces that I think have come to light, especially after Doug's reframing and kind of what you guys have all touched on. Cool thing, you know, LA Unified in our backyard, the second largest school district in the country. They are incorporating, and Terrence touched on this last week, they're incorporating arts as a core subject in their curriculum, or they're trying to. The board will be voting on that Tuesday. And with that sort of proposal comes a whole bunch of things that you know, they want to have happen. They want to find a way to measure success, or you know, successful education of students in the arts. Kind of look at what's been done, what they could do to measure that, which is, you know, kind of what we're looking at here. You know, what is arts education, or how do you measure our, you know, the learning of arts and its impact? Because they want to provide data to say that they're spending money to teach people arts, and that's effective. They're also going to try and bring funding levels back to the levels it was 5 years ago. So in this effort, there's going to be a lot of work that they're going to be doing over the next several months, if this measure passes, to look at what's been done in the past, what they're doing in the future, and kind of like what art education means, which I think is incredibly beneficial for us in terms of data mining, in terms of like having real life examples, because this would be a big deal. And you know, I just wrote a really, really brief thing at the end of the day. I wasn't even able to get the funding numbers from the district, but just to say, hey, this is on the radar, this is happening Tuesday. And I got like 250 people, you know, sharing it on Facebook. I mean, the arts community is really excited about this measure. And on Monday, the superintendent is unveiling with a bunch of arts nonprofits and community groups. They're unveiling a public arts exhibition, and they're trying to drum up money for the LA Fund for Education, which is a foundation by Megan Chernin, to try and fund this arts initiative. Because to make it a core curriculum subject, to make arts, you know, the emphasis within math, science, and English and social studies, will cost money. I mean, to bring back teachers, to hire teachers, to provide, you know, whatever measurements of data they're going to want to need to provide. That's all going to cost money.
Do we know the number?
Of teachers?
Of monies.
Of how much?
Yeah.
Actually, so I requested in the district for like the last 6-year breakdown, and so when that
We'll be able to find out, figure out something out.
I mean, first of all, there's no way to do a board informative for the Tuesday meeting without saying this is the difference in cost.
Yeah.
So that will definitely come out. And so I kind of wanted to say, like, this is pretty cool that this is going on at the same time. It sort of speaks to the issue that you know, that we've seen sort of anecdotally, and it's a very like tangible, substantive example of one of the issues of many of the issues we discussed in this project. I think that, you know, I spoke with Ricky about the funding. He's been trying to contact several districts to look at how funding's changed over the last 30 years. And I think the aim is really, at the very, very least, to just narrow down, like, how much money has been put toward arts education? How do these districts define that? And what percentage of the total budget is that, at the very least? And I mean, we can get more complicated, but, you know, school districts right now are pretty overwhelmed in general, so they don't necessarily have tons of people to be sifting through a lot of data. And we want to at least be able to paint a rough picture of what things look like on the horizon. And in that way, we can show sort of public versus private, where are arts happening now, where's that funding, where, you know, what agencies are doing arts. You know, I had a really interesting conversation with a spokesman at LA Unified. He was saying, he was really interested in the arts. I mean, and he would be a wonderful person to speak with. His name's Tom Walton. And he basically was saying that maybe we're living in, like, maybe there's this myth, a myth, you know, the nirvana of arts education 30 years ago. Because was it that much better? I mean, we have tons of arts still today. Was it that much better? I mean, it's hard to say. It's like saying, you know, school was better when I was in school. Everyone always says that every single year.
Music these days is awful.
Music these days is awful.
And that gets to a lot of what Doug was talking about the myths that are out there.
And there are a lot of myths, and you know, it would be nice to be able to provide something to dispel that. And I think all of this speaks to that access issue. If we can paint a picture of funding, if we can, you know, do a timeline that's interactive and say, okay, this is funding, Prop 13, Prop 98, these are the years. You know, No Child Left Behind, this is the year, and this is how funding has changed. I mean, that's very visual. That speaks to a lot of issues. Maybe we'll find that there is no correlation. If we can do a map and show, you know, map where arts are happening now, maybe where arts were happening 30 years ago, that would be, you know, ideal. You can also then see geographically where access is, like how access has changed. One thing in my conversation that came up was also the idea of arts being expensive. Like, is that an access barrier? You know, now are most of these places that are doing arts, are they nonprofits? Are they doing it for free? Are they charging people? Do you have to pay for those music lessons that you could have gotten for free? Do you have to buy your own instrument because, you know, they don't have them, orchestra can't afford to provide them to students? So I think there are a lot of issues there. Sean, you know, toy hacking. You know, the concept of that being a part of STEM learning and like kind of bridging education and bringing in a different way of approaching the arts and making it, you know, a part of you know, the economic engine, so to speak, of the U.S. I think that really speaks to this concept of what it means to educate kids and the blue collar, white collar concept of, you know, what are arts and whether you're trying to get people who are, you know, doing classic, you know, Monet style painting or doing something with their hands for, you know, to build something.
Right.
So I think that the toy hacking piece fits in quite. I loved what he was talking about, the STEM, STEAM.
What is that?
STEAM.
Yeah.
And
Science, tech, engineering, and mathematics. Those are the focus points that you know they're really trying to emphasize right now in school curriculum. And so he's sort of adding in arts.
So also in the reframing, really important area was how arts are being delivered. And what is the online community doing about that? That is something Sheena had, I hope you got your hands into that.
Not really, because the majority of it is on the higher education level. And even the examples I was sent, it was like everyone after grade 12. So it's like.
But we're not just looking, it's not just looking at arts education in the schools. I want to be clear about this. This is about how do people learn arts?
Young people.
You know, well, and everybody.
Everyone. But
Especially through the schools, but
Especially.
it's also how are the arts getting passed around? How do people learn them? This touches on many different pieces of this, and the online communities are huge.
I mean, online is about delivery. So what is this technology that didn't exist before? How does that change?
And no one's put it all
It's
together.
hard to quantify that, but I was doing hours of research this week on teenagers making online videos, some of which are like makeup demonstrations
Right.
and aren't necessarily art. I don't know if these kids are considering art. Others, these parodies and sketches and dance offs, like there'll be a contest where there's a dance and there's a video answering. There's a lot of that stuff.
Yeah,
It takes a lot of searching. And I don't know who you talk to, whether you try to get in touch with the kid who posted the stuff.
I was thinking
It just
that. I mean,
made me
it
think.
just, I'm running up against when you were saying, like, because that was my first thing, but when it comes back to, well, can you quantify it? Can you do, no. You can't quantify that.
But we need to know where these places, where they're happening. The online community cannot be ignored in the discussion of how arts are learned. It
When
can't
you're
be
saying,
ignored.
no, of course, not ignoring it, but I'm saying if there's not, there are no virtual classrooms in that sense. But if I'm covering that aspect of it, where outside of online, you mean like geographically?
When Michael Tilson Thomas pulls an entire orchestra together in Miami and the orchestra is spread out all over the world, That's online arts education and learning to a degree. And that's
But-
happening, and, well, anyway, this is a.
Only because last week you said that we're trying to localize the story.
I mean, I mean, when I say localize, I meant localize the impact of the story. So ultimately, we're drawing comparisons, but that doesn't mean you don't. I mean, you definitely want to bring in stuff. I mean, someone brought up Kentucky, and they're including arts in their educational core, right? I mean, that's comparative. That's a very, very relevant comparison, and that keeps. I mean, that's local. I mean, you can make that local. But I guess I would say by localizing, we don't want to be like just talking about Finland randomly out of the blue, but we want to draw comparisons that are salient, and so that keeps it to a local impact.
I just want to highlight that the key word, if there's one word in what Tammy was saying, and also what Doug is saying, it's access, right? So what we're looking at is because we started out by saying there's been a decline in the funding for arts education in the schools, okay. But Doug very interestingly said that there's been an enormous increase in the number of artists, arts institutions, and arts activities of all kinds. So now we want to reconcile that. So people do have access to arts education today, young and old. Where, how, who, what are the values? And a lot of that can be quantified.
Yeah, data has been generated to show how arts education benefits even success in the STEM. And LAUSD and others have this love affair with STEM. That seems to be where their emphasis is. How much influence or sway is showing this data going to have in the deliberations that are going on at LAUSD about it?
I mean, I think it would have incredible sway. The problem is that what the board's been doing recently is introducing a measure and voting on it the same day, and they introduce it at 2 separate meetings. So in terms of giving people time to reflect and really discuss, I mean, I suppose if people showed up in arms against it, they might put it off. But I mean, it will. I'm sure.
But after the fact, so they're voting on it now. That means that they're going to leave it to others to work out the details later.
The superintendent would have to come back by July 1st with a plan. July 1st, 2013. So, I mean, there's plenty of time to inform that. I mean,
So you're saying it is relevant. It may not be relevant for Monday, but it's going to be
incredibly relevant.
I'm a bit like confused with the arts education in general. Kind of, I went to Chatham Museum yesterday to an Etsy evening where people were learning how to make crafts. There was a local artist who was teaching them, and there were like a bunch of people from all ages. There were kids and older, from 6 to 75 years old people were there, and there were like 40 people. So it was really, really interesting. But I mean, what is that? Is that is like completely informal kind of arts education, and does it have anything to do with what we're doing here? I mean, the same museum doesn't have any outreach programs for schools or anything like that. So I mean, it depends.
Right. I mean, I think though that it's somewhat relevant. I mean, a lot of what we've seen recently. I mean, you mentioned all these various museums and places that have arts-related programming. If you look at sort of what LACMO's doing with the Knights of the Museum, I mean, there's a concept now that also, and this feeds into the whole myth of an arts nirvana perhaps in the past. Like, how do people today value arts? There's a concept that this generation doesn't necessarily value arts in the same way. That everything needs to be accompanied with flashing strobe lights and music or a DJ, and then people will come and spend time at the museum.
Yesterday was a date night. I completely
or
see
a
that
date
people
night.
actually
But
there were a lot of meeting
I mean,
each other.
so
yeah.
I mean, perhaps that's neither here nor there, but I think it's an interesting,
Yeah.
it's an interesting fact.
Yeah, but it kind of goes. It doesn't really. I mean, I feel that it goes a bit on the side, of the idea of. I mean, it's not only education. It's also about the whole institution changing the, what it used to be and what it
It's
is
a
now.
different delivery method now. I mean, and that speaks to the way perhaps it's valued. Maybe it's a less institutionalized value system of arts. Maybe it's less, government funded or public school funded. But maybe it's a little more alternative. But I mean,
they do that with like Rock the Vote too. It's like they're playing like whatever that guy's name is, T-Bone or I don't know. And then they're like the DJ. And did you guys see it on the campus the other day? Anyway, they do that with politics too. They know?
Because young people
Just-
today are apathetic as well.
Yeah. All young people.
All young people.
Yep.
Category.
Jen, I was curious, are you familiar with the Teaching Artist Support Collaborative? 'Cause it's a startup that they're working on, and like October 15th is their first kind of get-together meeting. And I wasn't sure, I don't know a whole lot about this group, I know that like LA Arts Council is kind of the one who's like putting it out there, kind of trying to get the publicity. But I don't know if this is like going to involve both institutionalized and non-institutionalized arts teachers, but it might be, I have a time conflict unless I decided to play a little hooky. I was excited about this because I thought it was a good opportunity to try and talk to maybe some arts teachers who are private lesson teachers who might just go not be involved in the schools, and maybe some others as well, to kind of make contacts and sources for, just to find out what they're doing, find out what they say about delivery methods, make other sources.
Actually, that's a really good point, because there are a lot of arts, a lot of arts teachers have lost their jobs. I mean, elementary arts education was on the cutting board for the LA Unified budget this past budget year.
Isn't it
So-
always?
What? Yeah, I mean, it's not very often, but I mean, it was like specifically that and marching band. I mean, it was reinstated later, but I mean, still a lot of layoffs came from those areas. And so it would be nice to know, well, what are they doing otherwise then?
Sure.
Right? I mean, they probably
And that gets
have to make a living.
right, so
Yeah.
right to what Doug is asking for. And so the nut graph of what Doug has in his reframing, reshaping of the education project is, I think we could build evidence that the traditional debate over arts education is misfocused, he says. So we don't want to, that's already been done. The case for decline in arts education is made by those who have delivered it institutionally. And that traditional delivery system has been under threat. So here, says Doug, is what we're going to do. We're going to show how delivery of arts education has and is changing. And we're going to begin to document that change, right? So it was in the schools primarily.
Right.
Now it's in so many
It's where you got it, it's where you got it. So
Yeah.
delivery, keep that notion, write it
Yeah.
down,
Who
delivery.
is delivering it, how and where, and who has access to it? How, where? And Doug says, reframe the issue as one of access rather than decline. This is what's going to make the stories
Yeah.
really
Right,
exciting.
Right.
Yeah.
What
And
about-
then finally, he says, reframe the issue in terms of values such as artistic, economic, anthropological, technological, even scientific, medical, right? That's.
Remember we were thinking about
Neuroscience.
neuroscience, I mean,
Yeah.
don't lose sight of
Right,
that.
so I mean, that was one of the things I was going to mention as well, but I wanted Sarah wanted to say something.
I just want, so just to sum that up, it's like with that focus, you will be on the cutting edge of this discussion. You'll be ahead of what anyone has ever reported on this.
It's all in the reframe.
Can I ask a dumb question? Can you elaborate a little bit on what it means to reframe in terms of access?
Yeah. If it used to be delivered institutionally, then your child had access by going to the public schools. It is no longer delivered institutionally as it was. There's less of it. So how do people have access to it?
And for
Not only
example,
how, but where and who doesn't, and what happens when they don't and when they do. Yeah.
for example, I mean, also when you look at comparisons between school districts, you might find that a school district with a very robust parent base that can actually fund programs will have institutional access. And you might not find that elsewhere. Now, does delivery step in, is arts then therefore delivered in other ways? In these areas where that doesn't happen? So, yeah, Sarah.
One thing that might be quantifiable is expenditures for schools to have museum tours. Museums generally, my mom works for a museum in Texas. Museums generally have curriculum building tours where they'll collaborate with teachers on doing a Picasso show or a tour of a Picasso show about math, or doing, building core curriculum into the tours that they do with students. That may be something that's reachable, that may be data that's reachable.
And that would be good because we could go to the museum and say how
Right.
many districts.
Right,
how often
exactly.
over
How
the
many
years.
kids do you
And that's
serve?
one spot for multiple districts as opposed to going to each district, and
Mhm.
that sort of takes the burden off the district as well. So, I mean, we could look at a few of the major museums in the SoCal region or whatever, or in California, a few of the major ones. That would be interesting.
Well, there was, I think Cheers at LACMA, actually, this past weekend. They were at the Watts Jazz Festival.
Oh, wow.
And they were just encouraging kids to come and play
Oh, yeah.
with paint. You know, they had a whole store set up, and that's how they were engaging. So it wasn't only about kids come to us, it was about, you know, the actual museums going out to the communities and setting up stores and saying, this is what you can do with paper and paint and a few pastels.
And
And
quite a few museums have buses that they can go to the schools with. And I noticed when I was looking through those that many of the smaller museums were actually offering more programs for the local schools than the bigger ones.
So,
And I think
to
there
me,
are
all of this
yeah,
should be on base
track
camp.
how
This is
many-
really great stuff. We only have
Yeah.
time for a couple more questions for Tamara.
Just a few quick things also, just to, the community college system, they run 112 campuses throughout the state. They've changed their enrollment, they just changed their enrollment policy, meaning that it's going to emphasize students with educational plans and with, efforts to transfer, graduate, certificate, meaning like the avocational person. You're there for your arts class or pottery class, you're not going to be able to get in. I mean, there's another major change to the way, the delivery system of arts. I mean, that's going to change it for a lot of people of all ages. I mean, if you want to go and take a class, they're not going to let you keep doing the same thing because you're shutting out someone who might be able to graduate and move on to a four-year institution from getting the class they need or the section they need. And so, I mean, that's just something to keep in mind as well. It's happening at all levels, and so we're just seeing this start to play out.
I'm interested in the intersection of this sort of delivery system conversation with what you were saying earlier, and was it Tom Waldman?
Yeah.
Okay. Sort of this sense of like false nostalgia for the past. I mean, this is pervasive in everything from like, I remember when political advertisements weren't nasty. Well, no you don't, because they've always been nasty. Or like, I mean, even Colbert has a new book that sort of addresses this, and the title is Re-Becoming the Greatness We Never Weren't. Like, it seems like a lot of areas in our that are important in our lives, we have this sort of false sense of nostalgia for something that may not have ever existed. Why is Thomas Kincaid so popular? Because his paintings make people feel good about, whatever. And I'm wondering
if you're talking about arts education in the schools, some of it is false nostalgia and some of it is real.
No, and I understand that,
and some of that is what we want to quantify. But more interesting than that is that there are just different ways that people are getting arts education these days. There are
exactly.
new ways.
So
Yeah.
are we better off now because
That's
there's
a good question.
That's a
Right.
great
there are
question.
different
Yeah.
ways?
That's the ultimate.
There are
Yeah.
more options, the
Yeah.
privatization, not to sound too
Right.
much like Mitt
Those are
Romney, but like,
questions to
are
ask.
we better off to have all of these other options that aren't government options?
Yeah.
Well,
Raise our children.
Yeah.
if you still believe in the value of public education, like a core curriculum for everybody, so that, we have a citizenry that is, uniformly trained in certain things, art should probably be part of it.
But this is the 21st century too, and we're individuals, and we customize how we consume everything. We customize every single aspect of our lives. We watch news channels that agree with our political viewpoints, and so maybe everything about the way that we learn is shifting too, away from one way to do things, one way to learn the arts. I don't know,
These are great questions.
I agree. There's something, listening to everybody talk, I think one thing is we're talking about two related but somewhat distinct things here. One being arts education is sort of, in the traditional sense of something that one took in learning about art history and, as part of a sort of all-round liberal arts education, and then sort of applied creative skills, a kind of toolkit of things that you use that can be applied to other disciplines, other creative fields, and that relates, to the thing Sean's been talking about so much about craft.
something that if any of y'all have time, I would really encourage you to do is to spend a day at the Art Center College of Design in Pasadena, which is a very expensive school and a fascinating place. I did a story there. Just in terms of, if we think of art and design, as more or less, coincident fields, or design as sort of an amplification of what art can be, they're doing things over there that are sort of fusing or merging these different functions of art, the aesthetic and the practical and the sociological and so forth. They have students over there who are doing things like designing, kind of a sort of portable, or what do you call it? It's a wheeled vehicle that Indian women in poor rural villages can use to transport, their, first they make them and then, use them to transport their wares, whatever it is. And these are not crude devices. These are well-engineered, made out of, reusable materials. They're environmentally friendly, and they're meant to be aesthetically pleasing as well. As much, at this school, there's as much an emphasis on making everything as pleasing as an iPad. That's the standard that they set over there. I sat in on another class where kids were doing design, looking at, they had to come up with a set of graphics to represent a clean water proposal. And how do you do that? In terms of the color scheme that you pick, all of those kinds of things, I think, are how people at a very high level, are thinking about what arts is and how that can be applied, to these kinds of real world situations. And just to, again, sort of picking up on what Sean said and looking at the threads here, I think one thing, bearing in mind is this is always, the question about how much arts education to give and what kind to give is a very political question. I happened to be living in England for a couple of years in the early 1980s when there were still what they called polytechnics. And these were schools like, design schools primarily. They taught very practical kinds of things. And they also were hotbeds of, primarily leftist opposition to what was then, the conservative government of Margaret Thatcher. And eventually Mrs. Thatcher closed down the polytechnics. And so, to me that opens up all kinds of interesting questions about what is it about, giving people sort of, is there a relationship between giving people the tools, that sort of empower themselves, technological tools, artistic tools, encouraging people to think in certain ways about redesigning, literally, the shape of their society, that does pose a challenge, to the established way of doing things. And I think, that is what artists do, among other things, and that's what arts education, can do. So, so I think, that relates very much to what you're talking about, too, the question of access and who gets it.
Yeah, and in this country, there was much more arts in the public schools when people thought they agreed on what art is, right? And they thought it was for the public good, and
About being an educated,
Yeah.
well-rounded sort of.
Yeah, and now that it's more about encouraging people to express themselves, well, a lot of people are against that, and don't want their taxpayer dollars going to that. But that's a perfect segue, unless you have a concluding.
I have a few things I wanted to touch on
Okay.
really quickly. I think we're going to need to look at sort of the economic and neurological, the scientific impacts and the economic impacts. Because when you talk about public, like the changes in the way it's delivered access, it all kind of hinges on the question of why does it matter? And so you're going to have to sort of, we're going to have to answer that question. Also, we have the opportunity to look at various systems here very locally throughout the county that emphasize arts, that don't emphasize arts, and that are starting to emphasize arts. I'm talking about the county system of education, I'm talking about magnet schools that focus on arts, and I'm talking about schools that have lost arts teachers. So these are very compelling comparatives. And then finally, just in terms of what we're looking for on a media level, we're looking for video, audio, photos, maps, graphics, interactive timelines. I think that all of these things can be broken up and used and made user-friendly and provide various interesting ways. We have videographers at KPCC who are doing amazing things who've been featured by the New York Times. So we have a place and a home to feature this stuff online as well as on the radio.
Great, wonderful. So think of your story ideas that fit that line and how you do it. That's
And
really great.
one other thing is Tammy and Reed and Drew want to be able to see your writing samples. If the one sample, not them, but put it on Basecamp.
Can you guys attach to your profile?
You know how you have your bios up there? I don't know if it will attach to the profile, but that would be helpful.
If you could link it or something, I mean, it's not absolutely necessary, but if you, and if you have several you want to add, feel free, but it would be nice.
If you have the website, send that URL.
Oh, you mean like our work? So we're writing
Just
other-
something-
So you're pitching, and maybe you're pitching your, something like the comparison between Finland and the United States, which you're not going to do. But, you know, that's one thing, but to
This is in
she would like,
addition to these pictures?
they would like to see your write, how you write.
No, just something you've done in the past that you're proud of, or a few
It
things.
does great legal briefs.
One more.
A brief would be great.
Okay. You're gonna stay, right? Okay, Tammy's gonna stay, and we're now going to hear from Reed.
Well, wait, does everybody need a minute to write their, yes, I think that was
Okay, good
useful,
idea,
right? Like
good
you
idea.
catch your breath,
Yes.
everybody get something down.
Okay.
On this. I actually am gonna write a little list as I, so, and Tammy, you may want to, like, just make sure that we cover these bases when we go through this at the end of the class, we're gonna do emails to Reed.
We're 15 minutes behind, Sasha.
15?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, you have 2 minutes, don't waste them, please.
That just sums up my